Hey guys, today I wanted to talk about requirements and how to gather them, what they're used for, and hopefully leading into how to actually use them to do design. This is a pretty fundamental part of every project, at least it should be. Mostly because you should actually know what you're trying to design. It's very useful for testing, as typically you end up testing your requirements. And in fact, it's often possible to future proof your application by writing better quality requirements. So you eventually get used to writing them in a way that allows you to design better. So certain words you use and certain structures um, to how you write them, basically. And I mean, it kind of changes from one project to the next, and it's a bit more ad hoc on certain types of projects. You might have a more sort of smaller, refined set of requirements, or um, you'll have a lot of very specific requirements. And it's kind of up to you on to what level of what's the word I'm looking for? Can't think now. It's up to you on how much detail you want to go in, how much of the system you actually want to cover. But the more you think about it now, the more it helps in the future. So the easiest way to approach this, particularly for game development, is you want to essentially write the overview of your game, the sort of thing that would appear on like the Xbox store or Steam or what Epic Games, your general overview. So you might have something like let me think. I'll write the one for the game I've been working on, and then I can explain how you pick it apart and you start structuring the requirements from there. Let me just set this up. There we go. Right. So, my game. So we've got. I'm just going to call it X for now. So it's a game about sorry, my typing's a bit terrible this morning. It's a game about surviving in a post. Yep, and my spelling is terrible. Wow. Is that actually okay? Fair enough. World. We have the it is split into factions fighting over territory and resources. So the player can gather, craft, build, and farm, let's say, to survive. Jeez, sorry. In this world. So, let's see. I also have it so the AI is quite significant in this. So, the factions in the world will fight each other over land and resources, and players over land and resources, causing control to change over time, something like that. that's a pretty basic description of my game. It covers most of the bases anyway. So usually I'd probably have a bit more of a description, better description, more specific, but this will do for now. So from this, you're essentially trying to pick apart key aspects of what your game requires. So if I get a bullet point list, so you have NPCs controlled by AI. You have items because you can gather, craft, build, and farm. There's gather. I want to say gatherables, but collectible resources. There's the concepts of building, farming, crafting. There's the idea of territory. So there's this concept of survival. Now I haven't fleshed that out fully in the description, but this is where you would start breaking this down into more specific parts. So I'll show this in a second. I think besides factions, obviously there's a world, but it's just important to note some things. Control can. Okay, so from this brief description, we pick apart key aspects or systems or components of the game, of the product, but game in this case, that we intend to cover. So when you go from this, if I change this to here, let's zoom in. So what we want to do is break this down into more manageable parts that can be effectively tested. So for example, the world contains collectible items. Items can be held by players or by NPCs. Items can be stored. Items can be used to craft. So, and you just think about every aspect of each of these in turn, and you just expand upon it. And what you'll find is that, as you can see, we've already established a couple of key aspects of the game that need to exist. Either functional concepts, like that players can hold items can be moved around, but also the fact that there's a thing called an item, a player, there's some storage concept, and so you can start to create this key ideas that you'll then go on to design and then implement later. And you may find that you hadn't considered the items are held by both players and NPCs. It would be weird if you didn't, but if you didn't consider that NPCs can hold items, you might start creating a system for handling player items and then a separate system for handling NPC items. Now that might be how you want to do it in the future, but if you hadn't considered this, you might end up developing these two separate systems and finding they're incompatible with each other in the future. And this is the advantage of thinking about things with requirements. And so you just go on doing this. So collectible resources. So resource nodes are scattered around the world. Resource nodes are renewable or not. So this is where you make these kinds of decisions. If I said resource nodes aren't renewable, then it raises the question of how do players get more resources if the world runs out? So there's that concept. Like if you say something like this, you can then start to sort of think of what happens if what are the consequences. So we've also implied a singular player here surviving in a world with NPCs. Well, what if we wanted multiplayer? And then do we have to then, this changes this part of the game entirely. And you can do the same for every part of your game, and you just keep expanding it. You just write more and more things, and eventually you end up with a lot better understanding of where you're going, what your game needs to conform to. And if I can find it quickly, I think it's this. I'll display it in a second. So here we go. So this is my decisions about my game. And so this is like on top of requirements. This is where I've made it. I've said, here's a decision I've made. Here's the advantages of that decision. Here's the disadvantages of it. And then how do you compensate for those disadvantages? So in my my survival game, I'm saying that everything's locked to a grid system. So unlike most survival building crafting games, I didn't want freeform building, or at least not to the same extent others allow, because it causes some problems, but it also allows me to make the points of interest conform to this structure as well, which makes it easy for random base building. But you can see I've said it ensures buildings don't clip into each other, makes building a lot more consistent, terrain can use it, the missions can check the grid. So now you can, rather than doing just a spherical radius to deny building too close to certain POIs or spawn points, I can just have grid slots that define whether they're part of this environment or not. And then I can just go, is it within these coordinates? Because if you consider, building, you don't want to actually create a grid, but you can fake one by using certain spacing to create squares based on a position. So you don't, if you wanted to figure out where you are and you're at 150 and 170 X and Y, and your grids were in a, every 200, you would know that you're in the first grid or slot because you're between 0 and 200 and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, the cons are, of course, there's no freeform building. The bases will look very standardized, and it will be arguably a little less creative. And you also couldn't do some of the cool stuff you can in games like Rust and DayZ, where you kind of hide buildings amongst the terrain as easily. Now, I didn't actually come up for any mitigations for this, but you can see you just think about what you're going to do and how you're going to compensate for it. And every time that you do something like this, you might discover problems. So you might go, oh, I hadn't quite thought of this. If, for instance, I've got this concept of melee weapons being almost like 100% lethal, because if you're in a shooter, the odds of you getting that close are pretty low, and so you might want to make it quite a lot more damaging. You've kind of reward the player for it. The problem is with AI and melee, the players might just trap them round corners and just take them out too easily and things like that. Anyway, so this is the typical approach that I tend to take in large projects that I've worked on in the past. You typically have a customer, or either an actual customer, somebody who's actually requesting things of you, or most likely in your case of game development, it's an arbitrary customer. And in that case, you ought to consider yourself the customer. What do you want the game to do? If you're playing this, do you want to have, I don't know, the game to be, I don't know, have like the 30 different buttons that you need to press? Or do you want it to be really straightforward? And do you want it to work on different platforms and all that kind of stuff? So yeah, hopefully this is just an introduction to this, but I will hopefully use the same. I'll be able to use this concept to then go into the design side of things and show you how to pick apart all of this text and actually turn it into usable classes, operations, attributes, all that kind of stuff. And then you can actually start to design code using this. So yeah, hopefully this helps somebody. It might not be particularly interesting, but I intend to keep going and potentially redo some of these videos and improve them in the future. But for now, I just need to do them. So I intend to carry on as best I can. So hopefully that's helped, and I'll see you guys around.